Zekthor winced as he shifted in his chair, the memory of last night's encounter still fresh in both his mind and his posterior. The purple-skinned Valdarian diplomat had faced many challenges in his 3 centuries of life, but nothing had prepared him for his first meeting with humans. The conference room aboard the neutral station buzzed with tension as representatives from 12 different species gathered for the most important diplomatic summit in galactic history. The Terran Federation had finally been invited to join the Galactic Council after decades of isolation, and Zekthor had volunteered to be their primary liaison. He thought it would be a simple assignment. How wrong he had been. The humans had arrived 6 hours late, which was already unusual by galactic standards where punctuality was considered sacred. Most species valued precise timing above almost everything else. When they finally docked, Zekthor had expected the typical formal procession he'd witnessed countless times before. Measured steps, ceremonial robes, perhaps some ritual chanting. Instead, the airlock had burst open, and 3 humans had practically bounced into the station, their faces split with enormous grins that showed far too many teeth. Zekthor had instinctively stepped back, his hand moving toward his ceremonial blade. In Valdarian culture, showing teeth was a sign of aggression, a prelude to violence. "Sorry we're late," the lead human had announced, completely unashamed. She was a small female with strange yellow hair that seemed to defy gravity, sticking out at odd angles. "We stopped to help a cargo freighter that was having engine trouble. Couldn't just leave them drifting out there, you know?" Zekthor had blinked his large obsidian eyes in confusion. Helping strangers was admirable, but arriving late to a diplomatic summit because of it was unprecedented. Most species would have logged the distressed ship's location and reported it to the proper authorities. Humans apparently operated by different rules entirely. The female human had then done something that made Zekthor's skin crawl. She had extended her hand toward him. Direct physical contact between strangers was considered deeply intimate in Valdarian society, something reserved for family members and the closest of friends. Yet here was this alien, offering to touch him as casually as breathing. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen," she had said, her hand still outstretched. "And you must be our liaison. Thanks for setting all this up." Zekthor had stared at the offered appendage as if it might bite him. Around the conference room, other diplomats watched with barely concealed horror. The crystalline ambassador's faceted form had actually dimmed with embarrassment, while the gaseous nebulans had contracted into smaller, more defensive formations. But something in the human's eyes had given Zekthor pause. There was no malice there, no attempt at dominance or control, just genuine warmth and what humans apparently called friendliness. Against every instinct screaming in his head, Zekthor had reached out and grasped the human's hand. The contact had been electric, literally. Humans, as it turned out, carried significant static charges due to their peculiar physiology and synthetic clothing. The shock had traveled up Zekthor's arm and straight to his brain, causing his secondary nervous system to spasm violently. For a Valdarian, this was roughly equivalent to being struck by lightning while simultaneously being tickled. He had let out a sound that roughly translated to "great spinning moons of madness," and had involuntarily launched himself 3 feet into the air. When he came down, he had landed hard on his tailbone, sending waves of pain through his entire lower body. The humans had immediately clustered around him, their voices raised in concern. This had only made things worse, as Valdarians interpreted loud voices as signs of anger. Zekthor had been convinced he was about to be attacked by a pack of wild predators. "Oh no, are you okay?" Captain Chen had asked, reaching toward him again. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know about the static thing. Here, let me help you up." "No," Zekthor had practically shrieked, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "No more touching, please." The other diplomats had watched this display with growing alarm. The Exarian representative had actually fainted, his insectoid form crumpling to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. The situation was rapidly spiraling into the worst diplomatic disaster in recorded history. But then something remarkable had happened. Instead of taking offense or becoming aggressive, the humans had simply adapted. Captain Chen had immediately stepped back, raising her hands in what Zekthor would later learn was a gesture of peace. Her 2 companions had done the same, all 3 of them creating space around the still traumatized Valdarian. "We're really sorry," one of the other humans had said, a tall male with dark skin and kind eyes. "We didn't mean to startle you." Every species has different customs, and we clearly didn't do our homework well enough. Can you tell us what we should do differently? This had been perhaps the most shocking moment of all. In 3 centuries of diplomatic experience, Zekthor had never heard anyone, let alone a species new to galactic politics, admit fault so readily or ask for guidance so humbly. Most new species either became defensive when criticized or attempted to dominate through shows of force. The humans had done neither. They had simply acknowledged their mistake and asked to learn better, slowly, carefully. Zekthor had explained about Valdarian customs, the importance of personal space, the meaning of exposed teeth, the sensitivity of their nervous systems. The humans had listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never interrupting or arguing. By the time the formal summit had begun, the humans had completely transformed their behavior. They kept their distance, spoke in softer tones, and had even somehow managed to make their smiles less threatening by keeping their lips closed. It was an impressive display of adaptability. The summit itself had been a revelation. Where other species presented carefully prepared statements full of flowery language and hidden meanings, the humans were direct and honest to a fault. They spoke plainly about their intentions, their capabilities, and their limitations. They shared technological data freely, offered assistance without being asked, and seemed genuinely interested in building positive relationships with everyone. But it was during the evening's cultural exchange that things had truly gone sideways, leading to Zekthor's current predicament. The humans had insisted on demonstrating something they called dancing, which apparently involved rhythmic movement to sound patterns. Zekthor shifted again in his chair, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of discomfort through his lower body. He had learned more about human culture in one evening than he had expected to learn in a lifetime, and his posterior was paying the price for that education. The cultural exchange had started innocently enough. Each species was invited to share something unique about their civilization, and most had prepared the usual fare: poetry readings, mathematical theorems, or displays of technological achievement. The crystalline delegation had performed a light refraction ceremony that painted rainbows across the walls. The Exarians had demonstrated their ability to create perfect geometric patterns with their movements. When the humans' turn arrived, Captain Chen had stood up with that same infectious grin that had startled Zekthor earlier. "We'd like to share something we call music," she had announced. "It's hard to explain, but maybe easier to show." She had produced a small device from her pocket, and suddenly the conference room was filled with something Zekthor had never experienced before. It wasn't the precise mathematical harmonies that most species produced, nor the purely functional communication sounds he was familiar with. This was something else entirely, a complex weaving of rhythms and melodies that seemed to bypass his rational mind and speak directly to something deeper. The music had a driving beat that Zekthor could feel in his chest, and layered over it were sounds that rose and fell like ocean waves. His translator had struggled with the human words being sung, producing fragments like "Can't Stop the Feeling" and "Sunshine in My Pocket." But the truly shocking part had come when the humans began to move. Dancing, they called it. And Zekthor had watched in fascination as all 3 humans began moving their bodies in ways that seemed to perfectly complement the sounds filling the room. Their movements were fluid yet energetic, coordinated yet individual. Captain Chen spun in place while her companions moved in patterns that somehow made visual sense of the audio chaos. Other diplomats had watched with expressions ranging from confusion to mild horror. The Nebulans had condensed into tight defensive spheres. The Valdarian cultural attaché had covered his eyes with his secondary hands, as if the display was too shocking to witness directly. But Zekthor had found himself mesmerized. There was something about the combination of sound and movement that spoke to a part of him he hadn't known existed. His feet had begun tapping of their own accord, his head nodding in time with the rhythm. "Come on," Captain Chen had called out, extending her hand toward the assembled diplomats. "Anyone want to try?" The silence that followed had been deafening. Participating in an unknown alien ritual was not something most diplomats were prepared to do, especially one that involved such energetic physical movement. But then Zekthor had surprised himself. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was the genuine joy radiating from the humans, but something had compelled him to stand up. I would like to try," he had announced, his voice barely above a whisper. The reaction from his fellow diplomats had been immediate and horrified. The Xarian representative had made chittering sounds of distress. The crystalline ambassador had flickered through several colors that roughly translated to social embarrassment and impending doom. Captain Chen's face had lit up like a star going nova.
Really, that's fantastic.
Don't worry, there's no wrong way to do it. Just move however the music makes you feel. She had started the song over, and this time Zekthor had tried to copy the human's movements. His Valdarian physiology was different. Longer limbs, different joint structures, a tail that he normally kept carefully controlled. But somehow the music made it all work together. At first, he had been stiff and awkward, overthinking every movement. But as the rhythm continued, something had loosened inside him. His movements became more fluid, more natural. He found himself actually enjoying the sensation of moving without purpose, without the careful protocols that governed every other aspect of his life. The other humans had cheered encouragement, showing him different steps and movements. They had been patient teachers, never mocking his mistakes or his obvious inexperience. When he accidentally spun too fast and stumbled, they had simply laughed, not at him but with him, as if his clumsiness was part of the fun rather than a source of shame. Other diplomats had gradually joined in, drawn by the infectious enthusiasm and the surprisingly non-threatening nature of the activity. The Nebulans had discovered they could pulse their gaseous forms in time with the beat. One brave Xarian had attempted something resembling the movements, though his 6 legs made it quite different from the human version. For 2 hours, the diplomatic summit had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. A spontaneous celebration where beings from across the galaxy had moved together, laughed together, and shared in something purely joyful. The problems had started when Captain Chen had introduced what she called advanced moves. "Okay, who wants to try a backflip?" she had asked, and before Zekthor could properly process what that meant, she had thrown herself backward through the air, rotating in a complete circle before landing on her feet. The display had been both terrifying and magnificent. Valdarians were not built for such acrobatics, but the music and the atmosphere of celebration had filled Zekthor with a confidence that was perhaps not entirely warranted. "I want to try," he had declared, ignoring the alarmed protest from his cultural attaché. Captain Chen had looked uncertain for the first time all evening. "Are you sure? It takes practice, and your body structure is different from ours." But Zekthor had already committed himself in his mind. In Valdarian culture, once you announced an intention publicly, backing down was considered deeply shameful. Besides, the music was still playing, still filling him with that strange human confidence. His attempt at a backflip had been spectacular in all the wrong ways. Valdarian anatomy was not designed for backward rotation. His tail had thrown off his balance, his longer limbs had gotten tangled, and his landing had been less graceful warrior and more sack of grain dropped from a significant height. He had crashed into the conference table, slid across its polished surface, and landed in a heap on the far side, his legs pointing in directions that legs were not meant to point. The pain had been immediate and intense, radiating from his tailbone through his entire lower body. The music had stopped abruptly. The humans had rushed to his aid immediately, their faces creased with worry and guilt. "Oh gods, are you okay?" Captain Chen had asked, kneeling beside him but carefully not touching. "Should we call a medic?" Zekthor had tried to stand and immediately regretted it. Moving sent fresh waves of agony through his spine. "I think," he had managed to gasp, "I may have damaged something important." The station's medical bay had confirmed his fears. He had bruised his tailbone, strained several muscles in his lower back, and somehow managed to pinch a nerve that controlled sensation in his legs. The medical officer, a competent but unsympathetic Rigelian, had informed him that he would be uncomfortable for several days. Uncomfortable had proved to be a significant understatement. The morning after the incident found Zekthor propped up on a specially designed cushion in his quarters, trying to find a position that didn't send shooting pains down his spine. The Rigelian medical officer had prescribed rest, anti-inflammatory medications, and what she had cheerfully called time for the swelling to subside. She had also recommended avoiding any further attempts at human recreational activities. A soft chime from his door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting perhaps his cultural attaché with updates on the diplomatic proceedings. Instead, Captain Chen stepped through the doorway, carrying what appeared to be a large, soft object and wearing an expression of deep concern. "Hi," she said quietly. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to check on you and, well, apologize properly." Zekthor shifted carefully in his chair, wincing as the movement triggered fresh discomfort. "Captain Chen, you need not apologize. The injury was the result of my own poor judgment, not any failing on your part." "That's not how I see it," she replied, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I should have known better than to suggest advanced moves without understanding your physiology. I let my enthusiasm override my common sense, and you got hurt because of it." She held up the object she had been carrying, a peculiar, squishy-looking thing that seemed to shift and conform to her grip. "I brought you something that might help. It's called a memory foam cushion. Human engineers developed it for people with back injuries. I thought, maybe it might be more comfortable than what you're using now." Zekthor examined the offering with curiosity. The concept of furniture that adapted to individual anatomy was intriguing, though he remained skeptical that human engineering could address Valdarian physiology. "That is thoughtful of you," he said carefully. "There's more," Captain Chen continued, producing a small bottle from her pocket. "This is ibuprofen, a human pain reliever. I checked with your medical officer, and she said it should be safe for Valdarian biology, though probably not as effective as your own medications." The gesture struck Zekthor as remarkable. Most species, when faced with an injured alien, would defer entirely to that species' medical protocols. The idea of sharing remedies across biological boundaries was both unusual and oddly touching. "You didn't need to do this," he told her. "Yes, I did," she replied firmly. "Taking care of people who get hurt on my watch is part of being a captain. Besides, I like you, Zekthor. You were brave enough to try something completely foreign and scary, and that takes guts." The word didn't translate well, but Zekthor understood the sentiment. "Brave or foolish," he said with what he hoped passed for humor. "The distinction may be academic at this point." Captain Chen laughed, a sound that Zekthor was beginning to find pleasant rather than threatening. Sometimes they're the same thing. Some of humanity's greatest achievements started with someone doing something that looked really stupid at the time. She gestured toward his current seating arrangement. "Would you like to try the cushion? It might take some of the pressure off your tailbone." With considerable effort and no small amount of discomfort, Zekthor managed to shift positions long enough for Captain Chen to place the memory foam cushion beneath him. The difference was immediate and remarkable. The strange material conformed perfectly to his anatomy, distributing his weight in a way that significantly reduced the pressure on his injured areas. "Better?" she asked hopefully. "Much," Zekthor admitted, surprised by the effectiveness of the human technology. "This is quite ingenious. How did your people develop such materials?" "Necessity," Captain Chen replied, settling cross-legged on the floor nearby. "Humans are really good at hurting themselves in creative ways, so we've gotten equally creative about fixing the damage. Plus, we spend a lot of time sitting in uncomfortable places: spacecraft, office chairs, economy airline seats. Comfort engineering is practically a survival skill for us." "Economy airline seats?" Zekthor asked, his translator struggling with the concept. Captain Chen's expression darkened comically. "Trust me, you don't want to know. Let's just say that your current situation would be considered luxurious compared to a 6-hour flight in coach class." Despite his discomfort, Zekthor found himself curious about this aspect of human culture. "Your people frequently travel in uncomfortable conditions. Is this some form of ritual punishment?" "More like economic necessity," she replied with a rueful smile. "But that's not important right now. What I wanted to talk to you about is what happened last night, and what it means for the summit." Zekthor's secondary stomach clenched with anxiety. "Have there been complications?" "Not the kind you're thinking," Captain Chen assured him quickly. "Actually, the opposite. What you did last night, trying to dance, attempting that backflip even though it was obviously dangerous for you, it made an impression on the other delegates." "I would imagine so," Zekthor said dryly. "Humiliating oneself spectacularly tends to be memorable." "That's not how they saw it," Captain Chen insisted. "The Exarian representative spent an hour this morning asking questions about human music and movement. The Nebulans want to know if we have any other rhythmic experiences they could try. Even the crystalline ambassador has been making inquiries about cultural exchange programs. Zekthor blinked his large eyes in surprise. Truly? Truly. You showed them that it's okay to step outside their comfort zones, that trying new things doesn't have to be a formal diplomatic process. You gave them permission to be curious instead of cautious. She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more serious. But more than that, you showed them something about humans that all our formal presentations couldn't communicate. You demonstrated that when we share our culture, we're not trying to dominate or convert anyone. We just want to share joy. Joy, Zekthor repeated thoughtfully. It was a concept that existed in Valdarian culture, but was rarely discussed in diplomatic contexts. Exactly. Most species approach first contact with suspicion, fear, or calculation. They want to know about our weapons, our technology, our territorial ambitions, and those are reasonable concerns, Captain Chen acknowledged. But you were willing to experience something purely for the fun of it, and that changed the entire dynamic. She stood up, moving to look out the small viewport in his quarters. The formal sessions this morning have been different. Instead of the usual careful negotiations and veiled threats, everyone's been asking genuine questions about each other's cultures. The Exarians shared their nest-building songs. The Nebulans demonstrated their collective decision-making process. It's like last night broke down some invisible barrier. Zekthor considered this information carefully. In 3 centuries of diplomatic service, he had never seen cultural barriers dissolve so quickly or completely. And you believe my misadventure contributed to this change? I think you showed everyone that humans can be trusted with their dignity, Captain Chen replied. When you got hurt, we didn't laugh at you or dismiss your pain. We took responsibility and tried to help. That's apparently not as common in galactic diplomacy as it should be. The implications were staggering. Zekthor had entered into human cultural practices thinking he was simply being polite, perhaps gathering intelligence on this new species. Instead, he had inadvertently become a bridge between 2 very different approaches to interspecies relations. 3 days after the dancing incident, Zekthor was finally able to attend the summit sessions again, though he still required the memory foam cushion and had to shift positions regularly. The change in atmosphere was immediately apparent. Instead of the rigid formality that typically characterized interspecies diplomacy, the conference room buzzed with animated conversation and what could only be described as excitement. Zekthor, called Ambassador Vexilai, the Exarian representative who had previously fainted at the sight of human enthusiasm. Her compound eyes glittered with unusual brightness as she approached his carefully adjusted seating area. I have been hoping to speak with you. I wanted to thank you for your demonstration the other evening. My demonstration? Zekthor asked, still not entirely comfortable with the attention his mishap had generated. Your willingness to embrace risk for the sake of experience, Vexilai clarified. Her antennae twitching with what Zekthor had learned was Exarian excitement. It inspired me to share our mating flight patterns with the other delegates yesterday. I have never done such a thing in a formal diplomatic setting. But your example showed me that vulnerability can be a form of strength. Zekthor was still processing this when the Nebulan's collective consciousness approached, their gaseous forms shimmering with patterns he didn't recognize. Zekthor entity, they spoke in their characteristic overlapping voices. We wish to express gratitude acknowledgement for your teaching demonstration of courage adaptation. Your willingness to risk personal comfort for cultural exchange has influenced our collective decision regarding human integration proposals. Your decision? Zekthor asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. Affirmative positive, the Nebulans replied. We had initially planned to propose extensive observation periods and cautionary protocols regarding human integration into galactic society. Your demonstration experience has shown us that humans possess compatibility traits that make such caution unnecessary counterproductive. Before Zekthor could respond, Captain Chen approached with 2 other humans he hadn't met before. Good morning, Zekthor, she said with a warm smile. How are you feeling today? Better, thanks to your cushion, he replied honestly, though I suspect I'll be feeling the effects of our cultural exchange for several more days. I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Kim, our xenobiology specialist, and Commander Marcus Torres, our cultural liaison officer, Captain Chen said, gesturing to her companions. They arrived this morning with some additional information that might interest everyone. Dr. Kim stepped forward, her dark eyes bright with scientific enthusiasm. We've been analyzing the recordings from the other night's cultural exchange, she said, and we've made some fascinating discoveries about cross-species compatibility and rhythmic response. She produced a small holographic projector and activated it, filling the air above them with a complex three-dimensional graph. Each species represented here shows distinct physiological responses to rhythmic stimuli, but there are underlying patterns that suggest a universal basis for what humans call music appreciation, Commander Torres added. What's even more interesting is that the willingness to engage with unfamiliar cultural practices appears to correlate strongly with positive diplomatic outcomes. Species that show flexibility in cultural exchange tend to develop more stable, long-term interspecies relationships. Zekthor studied the data with growing amazement. You're suggesting that dancing together makes for better treaties? In simplified terms, yes, Dr. Kim replied. Shared physical activities that require trust and coordination seem to build neural pathways that facilitate cooperation in other contexts. It's not just humans. We've found similar patterns in historical data from other successful interspecies alliances. The implications were staggering. Zekthor thought of all the formal diplomatic protocols he'd learned over 3 centuries, all the careful rituals designed to maintain distance and hierarchy. Have you shared this data with the other delegates? We wanted to discuss it with you first, Captain Chen said. After all, you're the one who made the discovery possible. Before Zekthor could respond, an alarm chimed throughout the station. The conference room's main display activated, showing the image of Station Commander Yoltek, a stern-faced Rigelian with little patience for diplomatic niceties. All delegates to your emergency stations, his gravelly voice announced. We have a developing situation in Sector 7. A civilian transport has suffered catastrophic engine failure and is on a collision course with the asteroid mining facility. All available ships are needed for evacuation assistance. The room erupted into activity, but not the kind Zekthor expected. Instead of each delegation retreating to discuss the situation with their superiors, something unprecedented happened. They began working together immediately. How many ships do we have available? Captain Chen asked the room at large. The Xarian science vessel can carry 50 beings in emergency configuration. Ambassador Vexlai replied without hesitation. Our collective ship can accommodate 100 entities in gaseous form suspension, the Nebulans added. The crystalline resonance craft could provide power coupling for emergency propulsion, the crystalline ambassador contributed, her faceted form pulsing with determination. Zekthor watched in amazement as the various species began coordinating their resources with an efficiency that typically took weeks of negotiation to achieve. The Valdarian diplomatic vessel has medical facilities and can serve as a triage center, he found himself saying. Captain Chen nodded approvingly. Perfect. Dr. Kim, can you coordinate medical protocols across species? Commander Torres, work with the station's traffic control to organize the evacuation routes. Within minutes, what could have been a disaster requiring hours of bureaucratic coordination had become a smoothly orchestrated rescue operation. Ships launched from the station in formation, each crew knowing exactly what their role would be and trusting the others to fulfill theirs. This is remarkable, Zekthor murmured to Captain Chen as they watched the rescue fleet deploy on the main display. This is what happens when beings trust each other, she replied. When you've danced together, literally stumbled and helped each other up, it becomes natural to assume good intentions instead of suspecting hidden agendas. The rescue operation proceeded flawlessly. The civilian transport's passengers and crew were evacuated safely. The mining facility was protected from collision, and the entire operation was completed in less than 2 hours. More importantly, it was accomplished through spontaneous cooperation between species that had barely trusted each other a week earlier. As the rescue ships returned to the station, Zekthor realized that something fundamental had changed in the nature of galactic diplomacy. The formal summit sessions that resumed later that day bore no resemblance to traditional interspecies negotiations. Instead of careful positioning and strategic maneuvering, the delegates engaged in genuine problem-solving, sharing resources and information with an openness that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. You know, Captain Chen said quietly as they watched the Xarian and Nebulans working together to design new communication protocols. I think you've accidentally revolutionized how first contact works. Zekthor shifted in his seat, still feeling the effects of his ill-advised backflip attempt, but now viewing his discomfort in an entirely different light. I believe, he said thoughtfully, that humans may have revolutionized far more than just first contact procedures. The pain in his tailbone suddenly seemed like a small price to pay for what was shaping up to be the most successful diplomatic summit in galactic history. By the 5th day of the summit, word of the unprecedented cooperation between species had spread throughout the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of other civilizations had requested permission to observe the proceedings, and the neutral station was struggling to accommodate the influx of visitors. Zekthor found himself in the unusual position of being something of a celebrity, though he still couldn't sit normally and had to explain his peculiar cushion arrangement to each new arrival. Ambassador Zekthor, announced Creon, the newly arrived delegate from the hegemony of worlds. We have traveled 3 standard cycles to witness this historic gathering. The reports reaching our territory seemed too extraordinary to believe. Zekthor shifted carefully in his specially arranged seating, noting how the hegemony representative maintained the traditional formal distance. I assure you the reports are quite accurate, though perhaps lacking in certain physical details. Creon's scaled features showed confusion. Physical details? Before Zekthor could explain, Captain Chen approached with her characteristic easy smile. Ambassador Creon, welcome to the station. I'm Captain Sarah Chen. We're honored to have the hegemony here to observe our proceedings. The hegemony delegate stiffened visibly as Captain Chen extended her hand in the now familiar human greeting gesture. Zekthor watched with interest as the same sequence of events began to unfold that had characterized his own first encounter with humans. Captain Chen, Creon replied formally, pointedly ignoring the offered hand. The hegemony has many questions about your unconventional diplomatic methods. I'd be happy to answer them, Captain Chen replied, smoothly withdrawing her hand without showing any offense. But first, would you like to meet some of the other delegates? I think you'll find their perspectives illuminating. What followed was a masterclass in human adaptability. Captain Chen had clearly learned from her earlier encounters and adjusted her approach accordingly. She introduced Creon to the other delegates in a way that respected traditional protocols while gradually demonstrating the new dynamic that had developed. The Xarian ambassador shared her research on cross-species cooperation patterns. The Nebulans demonstrated their collective decision-making process, inviting Creon to observe how multiple consciousness streams could merge temporarily without losing individual identity. The crystalline delegate performed a light refraction display that told the story of the past week's events in brilliant, shifting colors. Zekthor watched Creon's posture gradually relax as the presentations continued. The rigid formality that characterized hegemony culture was giving way to genuine curiosity, just as it had for all the other delegates. This is highly irregular, Creon murmured to Zekthor during a brief pause in the presentations. Where are the territorial negotiations? The trade dispute arbitrations? The formal protocols? Completed yesterday, Zekthor replied. We finished all the traditional diplomatic business in record time. When beings trust each other, negotiations become surprisingly efficient. But how did you achieve such trust? The hegemony has detailed reports on human military capabilities, technological development, potential territorial ambitions. Nothing in our intelligence suggests they should be so readily trusted. Zekthor considered his response carefully. How could he explain that everything had changed because he had tried to dance and fallen on his posterior? Perhaps, he said finally, our intelligence-gathering methods have been focusing on the wrong indicators. Before Creon could respond, an announcement echoed through the station. All delegates to Conference Room Alpha. Special presentation beginning in 10 minutes. Zekthor made his careful way to the conference room, noting how naturally the various species now accommodated each other's needs. The Nebulans had learned to maintain more solid forms when near beings who found their gaseous nature disturbing. The Xarians had modified their chittering communication to be less jarring to species with sensitive hearing. The humans had toned down their enthusiasm to levels that didn't trigger defensive responses in more cautious species. In Conference Room Alpha, Captain Chen stood beside a large holographic display showing what appeared to be a star map. Over the past week, she began, We've had the privilege of learning about each of your civilizations in ways that go far beyond formal diplomatic briefings. We've shared music, food, stories, and even some rather spectacular failures. She glanced at Zekthor with a warm smile that somehow managed to be both apologetic and grateful. But more importantly, we've discovered that cooperation between our species isn't just possible, it's beneficial for everyone involved. The holographic display shifted to show a complex web of connections between star systems. Dr. Kim and Commander Torres have been working with your science teams to model what galactic civilization could look like, with increased cooperation. The results are remarkable. Dr. Kim stepped forward to explain the projection. By sharing technological innovations, pooling scientific research, and coordinating resource distribution, we could eliminate scarcity-based conflicts throughout this entire galactic arm within 50 standard years. The display showed trade routes optimized for mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage, research stations jointly operated by multiple species, and crisis response networks that could address emergencies like the recent transport incident in minutes rather than days. More importantly, Commander Torres added, our psychological studies suggest that species engaging in regular cultural exchange show significantly reduced aggression indices and increased innovation rates. Simply put, being friends makes everyone smarter and more peaceful. Creon leaned forward in his seat, his scaled features showing intense interest. These projections assume continued cooperation. What mechanisms would prevent reversion to competitive behaviors? Captain Chen's smile widened. I'm glad you asked. We'd like to propose something we're calling the Cultural Exchange Protocol. The holographic display shifted again, showing a new type of diplomatic structure. Instead of traditional embassies focused on formal negotiations, we propose establishing cultural centers on each member world. Places where beings from different species can come together to share food, music, stories, and yes, even attempts at dancing. The key insight, Dr. Kim explained, is that cultural exchange creates emotional bonds that transcend political calculations. When you've helped someone up after they've fallen, when you've shared a meal or a song or a moment of laughter, it becomes much harder to see them as a threat. Zekthor felt a strange sensation in his chest, something between pride and embarrassment. His ridiculous attempt at human dancing had somehow become the foundation for a new model of galactic civilization. There are practical considerations, Ambassador Vexli pointed out. Resource allocation, territorial boundaries, trade dispute resolution. Not everything can be solved with cultural exchange. Absolutely correct, Captain Chen agreed, which is why we propose a hybrid system. Traditional diplomatic channels for formal negotiations, supported by ongoing cultural exchange to maintain the trust and understanding necessary for those negotiations to succeed. The room fell silent as the delegates considered the proposal. Zekthor could practically see the mental calculations taking place as each representative evaluated the potential benefits and risks. Finally, Creon spoke. The hegemony would need to see a practical demonstration of these cultural exchange protocols before committing to such a radical departure from established diplomatic practices. Captain Chen's eyes lit up with that familiar spark of enthusiasm. Would you be interested in attending our closing ceremony tonight? We were planning another music and movement session, and we've learned a lot about safety precautions since our first attempt. She glanced meaningfully at Zekthor's cushioned seating arrangement. We've made some significant improvements to our risk assessment procedures. Despite everything he had experienced over the past week, Zekthor felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Another human cultural event meant another opportunity for spectacular failure, but also another chance to bridge the gap between species. I believe, he said carefully, that Ambassador Creon would benefit greatly from experiencing human cultural practices firsthand. Though perhaps we should start with something less acrobatic than backflips. The laughter that filled the room came from a dozen different species, each expressing amusement in their own unique way, but all sharing the same sentiment. For the first time in galactic history, beings from across the stars were laughing together about the same absurd situation. Zekthor shifted in his seat, still feeling the effects of his cultural adventure, and realized that his inability to sit properly had somehow become the most comfortable position in the galaxy. The closing ceremony was held in the station's largest cargo bay. hastily converted into what the humans called a party venue. Zekthor arrived early, partly because walking took him longer than usual in his current condition, and partly because he wanted to observe the setup process. What he saw both impressed and concerned him. The humans had clearly taken his injury to heart. The entire floor was covered with what appeared to be soft, shock-absorbing material. Cushioned barriers had been installed around the perimeter. Most tellingly, several medical stations had been positioned at strategic intervals, staffed with personnel from multiple species. Taking no chances this time, Captain Chen said, approaching with her usual warm smile. She carried a peculiar piece of equipment that looked like a cross between a harness and a safety net. Dr. Kim designed this stability assist device. It's completely optional, but it might let you try some movement without risking another landing incident. Zekthor examined the device with curiosity. You developed new technology specifically to accommodate my poor coordination? We developed new technology to make sure everyone can participate safely, she corrected. Your coordination isn't poor. You just tried to do something your body wasn't designed for. That's on us for not thinking through the safety implications. The arrival of Ambassador Creon interrupted their conversation. The hegemony representative approached cautiously, his scaled features showing the careful neutrality that characterized his species. Captain Chen, I must admit to some apprehension about this evening's activities. Completely understandable, Captain Chen replied. First time experiencing human culture can be overwhelming. We've learned a lot about pacing ourselves since our first attempt. She gestured toward a corner of the cargo bay where several delegates were already gathering around a table laden with food from various worlds. Tonight's agenda is much more relaxed. Food, conversation, and some very gentle movement activities. No acrobatics, I promise. Creon looked unconvinced. The hegemony's risk assessment protocols strongly discourage participation in uncontrolled physical activities with alien species. Smart policy, Captain Chen agreed. Mind if I ask what specific risks you're concerned about? Maybe we can address them directly. Zekthor watched this exchange with interest. The captain's approach was remarkably different from traditional diplomatic responses to such concerns. Instead of offering vague reassurances or taking offense at the implied distrust, she was treating Creon's caution as a legitimate problem to be solved. Physical injury, obviously, Creon began, glancing at Zekthor's specialized seating. Cultural contamination, loss of diplomatic objectivity, potential exploitation of vulnerability. All reasonable concerns, Captain Chen acknowledged. Let me show you what we've learned. She led them to one of the medical stations where Dr. Kim was reviewing safety protocols with a mixed team of medical personnel. Dr. Kim has been working with the medical officers from every delegation to understand the physical limitations and risk factors for each species. We now have detailed safety profiles for everyone attending. Dr. Kim looked up from her notes. For example, hegemony physiology shows excellent resilience to impact trauma, but potential sensitivity to rapid temperature changes. So we've set environmental controls to maintain optimal comfort zones and eliminated any activities that might cause overheating. Cultural contamination? Captain Chen continued, addressing the next concern. Commander Torres has some interesting research on that. Commander Torres approached carrying a datapad filled with psychological assessments. Actually, our studies suggest that exposure to diverse cultural practices strengthens rather than weakens cultural identity. Beings who experience other cultures tend to develop a clearer understanding of what makes their own culture unique and valuable. As for exploitation of vulnerability, Captain Chen said with a slight smile, I think Zekthor can speak to that better than anyone. Zekthor carefully adjusted his position to address Creon directly. I shared something deeply embarrassing with beings I barely knew, and instead of using that vulnerability against me, they took responsibility for my welfare and worked to ensure my comfort. In 3 centuries of traditional diplomacy, I have never experienced such genuine concern for my well-being from another species. Creon's expression showed skepticism. But surely there must be some hidden agenda, some strategic advantage the humans gain from this friendship approach. Before anyone could answer, a commotion from the entrance drew their attention. A group of Xarians had arrived, carrying what appeared to be musical instruments adapted for their unique physiology. Behind them came the Nebulans, who had somehow managed to contain their gaseous forms in decorative, translucent containers that pulsed with internal light. "There's your strategic advantage," Captain Chen said quietly. "Look around this room. See how many species are here? See how they're interacting?" Zekthor followed her gaze and realized she was right. The cargo bay now hosted representatives from 15 different civilizations, and instead of clustering in species-specific groups as was traditional, they were mingling freely. Xarians were examining Nebulan's light displays with scientific curiosity. Crystalline delegates were sharing harmonic patterns with the newly arrived hegemony security detail. Even the notoriously antisocial void dwellers had emerged from their environmental suits to sample exotic foods. "This isn't about gaining advantage over anyone," Captain Chen continued. "It's about recognizing that cooperation produces better outcomes for everyone than competition. When we help each other succeed, we all benefit." The evening's activities began with what Captain Chen called cultural show and tell. Each delegation was invited to share something unique about their civilization. But unlike the formal presentations of the first day, these demonstrations were interactive and personal. The Xarians performed a nest-building song that somehow involved the audience in creating harmonies with their own voices. The Nebulans taught everyone how to read their collective emotion displays, turning the entire room into a living mood indicator. The crystalline delegates created a light show that told the story of their first space voyage, with each beam of light representing a different challenge overcome through persistence and innovation. When the humans' turn came, they surprised everyone by not performing themselves. Instead, Captain Chen announced that they wanted to learn something from each species present. "We've realized," she said, "that the best way to honor other cultures isn't to show off our own, but to genuinely learn from yours." What followed was an extraordinary hour of teaching and learning. The Xarians taught interested humans their complex harmony creation techniques. Several Nebulans guided brave volunteers through the basics of collective consciousness sharing. The crystalline delegates showed anyone willing to learn how to create simple light patterns through focused thought. Zekthor found himself teaching a group of humans and two curious Xarians about Valdarian meditation techniques, which involved precise control of breathing and posture. To his amazement, several of the humans proved remarkably adept at the practice, despite their very different physiology. "This is fascinating," Dr. Kim said during a break in the activities. "Every species here approaches problem-solving differently, but when you combine the techniques, you get solutions that none of us could have developed alone." Creon, who had spent the evening observing from a cautious distance, finally approached Zekthor during the refreshment period. "I must ask," he said quietly, "are you not concerned about the security implications of sharing cultural knowledge so freely?" Zekthor considered the question carefully. "A week ago I would have shared your concerns, but I have come to realize that the greatest security threat we face is not invasion or conquest. It is isolation and misunderstanding." He gestured toward the room full of interacting species. Every conflict in galactic history has begun with one group believing that another group represented a threat to their way of life. But when you understand someone's culture, when you have shared experiences with them, it becomes much harder to see them as an enemy. "But surely there are limits," Creon pressed. "Some knowledge must remain protected, some boundaries maintained." "Absolutely," Zekthor agreed. "But those boundaries should be based on genuine security needs, not on fear of the unknown. The humans have shown us something remarkable. They have shared their culture freely, made themselves vulnerable, and gained strength rather than losing it." As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Chen approached with a plate of food from various worlds. "How are you two doing?" "Creon, I noticed you haven't tried any of the cultural exchange activities yet. Is there anything specific you'd be interested in learning about?" The hegemony representative looked uncertain. I am not accustomed to such informal interactions. My training emphasizes maintaining professional distance in diplomatic settings." "Understandable," Captain Chen replied. "Would it help if we started with something less interactive? Maybe just observing some of the teaching sessions?" As the evening progressed, Zekthor watched Creon gradually become drawn into the activities despite his initial resistance. 6 months later, Zekthor stood in the newly constructed Cultural Exchange Center on Valdarian Prime, watching as the first group of human exchange students attempted to master the art of traditional Valdarian pottery. The sight of Captain Chen, now Ambassador Chen, carefully shaping clay with her characteristically enthusiastic but imprecise technique, brought back vivid memories of that first disastrous attempt at dancing. "Your form is improving," he told her as she held up a lopsided bowl that bore only passing resemblance to its intended shape. "Liar," she replied cheerfully, examining her creation with the same good humor she had shown during his backflip disaster. "But I appreciate the encouragement. How's the back feeling these days?" Zekthor shifted slightly, noting that while the acute pain had long since faded, certain movements still reminded him of his adventure in human acrobatics. "Functional," he said diplomatically, "though I have developed a healthy respect for the importance of proper warm-up procedures." The Cultural Exchange Center hummed with activity around them. In one corner, a group of Xarian children were teaching human youngsters how to weave nest songs, their chittering laughter mixing with human giggles in a sound that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Near the windows, several Nebulans had formed a collective study group with Valdarian philosophers, their gaseous forms pulsing with the rhythm of shared thought patterns. "The council vote is tomorrow," Ambassador Chen said quietly, setting aside her pottery attempt. "How do you think it will go?" Zekthor considered the question carefully. The proposal to formalize the cultural exchange protocol had generated intense debate throughout the galaxy. Traditional diplomatic factions argued that such informal arrangements undermined established security protocols. Progressive groups pushed for even more radical reforms, and a significant middle faction remained uncertain about the long-term implications. 6 months ago, I would have said the traditional factions would never accept such a departure from established procedures, he admitted, but the results speak for themselves. The results were indeed remarkable. Trade disputes that previously took years to resolve were now settled in weeks through informal discussions between beings who knew each other personally. Scientific research projects that had been stalled by interspecies suspicion were advancing rapidly through collaborative efforts. Most significantly, 3 potential military conflicts had been diffused through cultural exchange visits before they could escalate to actual violence. The hegemony's support surprised everyone, Ambassador Chen noted. Zekthor smiled, remembering Ambassador Creon's transformation from cautious observer to enthusiastic advocate. "Did you know he has requested permanent assignment to coordinate hegemony cultural exchange programs?" Apparently, learning crystalline harmonic mathematics changed his entire perspective on the value of diverse approaches to problem solving. A chime from his personal communicator interrupted their conversation. Zekthor activated the device expecting routine administrative updates, but instead found himself looking at the concerned face of High Counselor Rathnex from the Galactic Council chambers. "Zekthor," the High Counselor said without preamble, "we have a situation developing that requires your immediate expertise. Can you and Ambassador Chen reach the council chambers within 2 hours?" "Of course," Zekthor replied, his diplomatic instincts immediately engaging. "May I ask the nature of the situation?" "First contact," Rathnex said grimly. "A species we've never encountered before. They appeared at the edge of council space 6 hours ago with a fleet of ships and what appears to be hostile intent. Traditional diplomatic overtures have been unsuccessful." Ambassador Chen moved closer to the communicator. "High Counselor, this is Ambassador Chen. What specific challenges are you encountering with standard protocols?" "The new species, who call themselves the Korthax, have rejected all formal communication attempts," Rathnex explained. "They respond to diplomatic hails with what can only be described as aggressive posturing. Our xenolinguistics teams are struggling to establish even basic communication, and our military advisors are recommending defensive preparations." Zekthor felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. First contact situations were among the most delicate in galactic diplomacy, requiring careful balance between caution and openness. "What makes you think our particular expertise would be relevant?" "Because," Rathnex said with something that might have been a smile, 6 months ago you convinced 15 species to trust each other by falling down and getting hurt. If anyone can figure out how to turn hostile aliens into friends, it's the team that revolutionized diplomacy through dancing." 2 hours later, Zekthor found himself in the Council's Crisis Management Center, studying holographic displays of the Korthax fleet. The ships were unlike anything in existing databases, organic-looking structures that seemed to pulse with internal life, covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating. Initial scans suggest silicon-based biology, Dr. Kim reported, now serving as the Council's chief xenobiology advisor. Extremely dense bone structure, redundant organ systems, and what appears to be natural electromagnetic shielding. These beings are built for survival in hostile environments. Their ships are equipped with impressive weapons arrays, Admiral Vorthen added from the military briefing station. But interestingly, they haven't powered up their weapon systems. They're maintaining what we would consider a defensive posture. Ambassador Chen studied the tactical displays with the same intensity she had once applied to learning Valdarian pottery. Have we tried non-standard communication methods? Music, visual patterns, mathematical sequences? All standard approaches have been attempted, High Counselor Rathnex confirmed. They respond to direct communication attempts with aggressive displays, ships moving in attack formations, electromagnetic pulses that our translation systems interpret as threats or warnings. Zekthor watched the recordings of the Korthax responses, noting something that the others seemed to have missed. These aggressive displays, he said slowly, are they consistent? Do they follow patterns? Dr. Kim activated a comparison analysis. Actually, yes. Each response follows a similar sequence. Ship movements, electromagnetic pulses, then a return to defensive positioning. It's ritualized, Ambassador Chen said suddenly. They're not actually being aggressive. They're performing some kind of formal response protocol. Like a greeting dance, Zekthor added, the pieces clicking together in his mind. Remember how my exposed teeth were interpreted as aggression? What if our formal diplomatic protocols are being interpreted as hostile by their cultural standards? High Counselor Rathnex looked skeptical. You're suggesting that our attempts at peaceful communication are being perceived as threats? It's possible, Dr. Kim said, pulling up cultural analysis charts. Many species have ritualized combat displays that serve as social communication. If the Korthax culture evolved in a particularly dangerous environment, they might use displays of strength as a way of establishing mutual respect. Ambassador Chen was already moving toward the communication station. What if we tried responding to their displays with similar energy? Not threatening, but matching their intensity? That could be catastrophically dangerous, Admiral Vorthen warned. If we misinterpret their intentions and escalate the situation, or it could be exactly what they're waiting for, Zekthor countered. Sometimes the greatest risk is in avoiding all risks. He thought about his ill-fated backflip attempt, about the spectacular failure that had somehow opened doors to unprecedented cooperation. Ambassador Chen, do you remember what you told me about the importance of being willing to look foolish in pursuit of understanding? She grinned, that familiar spark of enthusiasm lighting up her eyes. Are you suggesting we try to dance with hostile aliens? I'm suggesting we try to communicate with beings who might not be hostile at all, just misunderstood. Zekthor replied. After all, the worst that could happen is that I end up unable to sit properly again. The Crisis Management Center fell silent as the implications sank in. They were proposing to abandon centuries of established first contact protocols in favor of an approach based on cultural intuition and mutual vulnerability. High Counselor Rathnex looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each advisor and specialist. This is highly irregular, he said finally. But given the alternative is potential armed conflict with an unknown species, I'm willing to authorize the attempt. Ambassador Chen moved to the primary communication console. Dr. Kim, I need you to analyze their display patterns and help me design a response that matches their energy without appearing directly threatening. Zekthor, she continued, I need you to help me figure out how to make ourselves vulnerable enough to demonstrate peaceful intent without appearing weak. As the team began working on their unconventional response to the Korthax fleet, Zekthor realized that his inability to sit properly after that first cultural exchange had become the foundation for an entirely new approach to interspecies relations. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important discoveries came from the most embarrassing failures.